We're going to get started. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. For those who may not know, my name is Hirak Vartanian. I'm the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. And this is the second lecture in the Emily Hall Tremaine Fellowship for Curators in journalism. And we're very proud to have Brianna Hernández here. Hi, Brianna. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to start by saying that Hyperallergic is based in Brooklyn. So we want to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Lenape, the Shinnecock, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. So we wanted to start with that acknowledgement. And then I want to introduce Brianna, who I'm very excited to introduce because I think the topic of death, many of you will agree, is something that has been very much part of art from the very, very beginning. And I think that's why this topic has really brought in a lot of interest from people, but also, many people may not know, but the various cemeteries in the city were often the places people would go in the 19th century to see sculpture and other things. So the culture of art and death are really not that different in the city and in many places around the world. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that to sort of understand where some of this conversation may head. So first of all, I want to introduce Brianna, who's a Chicana artist, curator, educator, and death doula. Not really something you hear every day, but as we'll understand that it's actually becoming more and more prominent in death doulaing is becoming very much part of the practice of many artists. And she's created multimedia installations focused on end-of-life care, grief, and mourning rituals. She's the director of curation and a board secretary of Ma's House and BIPOC Art Studio, and assistant curator at the Parrish Art Museum. Welcome, Brianna. Pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me and for this amazing opportunity.
Well, I think one of the things about your proposal that was really great was not only just the topic, but you're also looking at artists that, have really been serious in terms of a number of them are death doulas themselves and, have really sort of taken on their artistic practice that is very much part of their non-artistic work as well, it feels like. I mean, is that an accurate way of explaining your own interest in some of the art?
Absolutely. I think what ties a lot of the artists throughout the different articles together is how it's been integrated into other areas of their lives. Something that, as you mentioned, a lot of people incorporating death doulaship into their art is something that's become a really important tool in bridging this gap between you experience this artwork that has all these charged emotions, and then where do you go with that? And a lot of times when artists incorporate that training or those resources and that knowledge into the works or into things related to the works, they can really offer support, but also then the creative practice informs how they're able to reach more people with that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, do you want to explain what a death doula is for those who may not be aware, because I'm sure that question is going to come up and people may not be aware of that. So do you want to explain that?
Yeah, sure. It's a question I get a lot. It's interesting because being a death doula is something that has been around forever. It's just kind of, it hasn't been prominent in the way that we handle death in our current society. But essentially, it's similar to what people think of when they think of a birth doula, in that you're a support role, but instead of supporting through the birthing process, which can include everything from, planning to have a child to everything after the child arrives, a death doula really supports the entire death process, but might have a specialty within that. And so some death doulas, they focus on helping people with advanced planning, which is something you can do at any time. And we often encourage people to do it early and to check in with it often because, your plans might change depending on if you move or if you get married. But also can be someone who is, really with the family, with the loved ones near the time leading up to death, whether that's in someone's home or in a hospital and anything in between. And so a lot of us have a different specialty that we focus on, whether that's a specific religious spiritual practices that we can offer support a few of us have background in the arts, while others have background in therapy and psychology. And so there's a lot of layering to it. The person that I took my coursework with, Alua Arthur, runs Going with Grace, and she actually started as an attorney. And much of her practice when she first started was helping people figure out all the legal aspects of dying. And so in that sense, that was her focus as a death doula. But it can really range. And so it's really about finding someone who's the right fit for you. But you can have that conversation at any stage of life.
Yeah, it's interesting you say how death doula was historically was more common. What do you think changed that being a death doula was somehow out of fashion, or I don't know how you want to characterize it, but what do you think it is about that? And what are some of the difficulties you see when someone approaches you with that, or maybe when you tell somebody, some of the reactions you might get?
Yeah, it's pretty layered. And interestingly enough, it's also similar to birth doulas in how it used to be something that was very family led by different women in community, and they were kind of the keepers of those practices, the knowledge behind it, and how you really cared for someone holistically in those transitional times.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, with more industrialization, with more commercialization of not only the funerary industry but the medical industry as well, it's become something that's more and more regulated by people outside of the community. And it's not just a matter of, oh, this is convenient, or, oh, this is a system we have set up for it that you can plug into. It's also built into a lot of our laws. So where and how you're allowed to die, and where and how you're allowed to be buried, it becomes so complex that most of the time the easiest thing to do is hand it over to these systems, so that we're not breaking the law or causing ourselves a years long headache after someone dies. And now, because it's something that's reemerging, it's speaking to a lot of the cracks in those systems that have shown up over the years, with different disparities, with just the sheer volume of people who are within those systems. And so sometimes the criticism or feedback is like, well, why do you need a death doula to support near the end of life when you have hospice? And it's interesting because there's a lot of people who from their experience in hospice, at being trained in hospice, have added death doula work to their practice because they see those gaps, and because it's not evenly distributed. Some people have incredible, amazing, beautiful experiences with hospice, and other people have really, really bad ones that are traumatizing. And so it's based on a need. It's reemerging because there's an unmet need for people to have meaningful, personalized, and culturally sensitive deaths experiences. And so it's something that is not also this cookie cutter. It's very adaptable to the needs of the person. That's really a central tenet that a lot of death doulas follow, is you're meeting someone where they're at, and you're advocating for what the person who's dying is really wanting.
Yeah. And now, so how do you see the connection with art? Because one of the interesting things about it is not only cemeteries that I mentioned, it's like Greenwood Cemetery with all its beautiful sculptures in the 19th century. Some of the best artists in the city were making these, but also the historical record, because some of the earliest examples of art tend to be connected to burials or funerary rituals or different things. And in one of your articles, you talk about the pyramids of Egypt, and people almost forget that they're funerary structures. Do you know? So what is it about that connection with art that really interests you? And what do you think is perhaps special about that relationship that you find that artists, look into again and again?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it stems from a larger interest in this idea that art is not meant to be separate from our everyday lives. And nowadays, most of the time when we think of experiencing art, we think of going to a museum and looking at something on a shelf or behind a box, or hung up on the wall. And I've always been interested in communities across time and all over the world where there's not this distinction of like, this is a separate thing that you have to put up in a special place, but more so this is a part of how we have a shared identity and a shared understanding of values. And so funerary artifacts are a really wonderful example of how that started and the way that it's continued. And I also think of them as an opportunity to return in the same way that death doulaship is reemerging out of a need. I think that the art practices around funerary rites are responding to a lot of needs around the meaning making, the legacy building, and how we can share in this understanding of what does this moment in time mean. If you just like have something happen and then you keep going without acknowledging it, without spending time, it can almost feel like a dissonance with your reality. And so these
Absolutely.
art objects and art experiences surrounding death and dying are critical in holding that transition and helping people come together around what does this transformation mean for me and my family and my community.
Absolutely. I mean, I love this conversation because I feel like when it comes to death, it's also one of those things that people have very strong opinions about. And they sort of come out in these funny ways, and people have very strict. So how do you deal as a curator dealing with this? Because this work is very personal work often. And it's about very like, and I can imagine the people making it have very specific visions of how it wants to be seen, or maybe the context. Now, can you tell us give us a little insight about, as a curator, how you approach this, and perhaps, if at all, differently from other material?
I've had the great privilege of working with artists over the years on really personal and charged topics. And so it's something that I've learned over the years, what are, better ways to handle someone else's story. And it's also an ongoing process because everybody's different and everybody has different needs. And so you really want to be mindful and adaptable to whatever that entails. But a big part of it is honestly just relationship building over time, getting to know people, getting to know not only like the work that ends up in the show, but the work that they make around that. And what is the thing that they find most valuable, most important about their story, even if it's not very obvious in the final work. And so at least in this case, each of the artists that I've included, I have had, over time, been following their work and trying to learn more about them, and really letting that lead, where the conversation goes, and then a lot of back and forth discussions about does this feel right, wanting to make sure that I'm not centering my own subjective lens, but really making clear what their message is.
Absolutely. So why don't we start looking at the exhibition? We can continue the conversations there. And I just want to invite people, because we're, going to have an extensive conversation. If you have questions, feel free to add them. We'll try to address them immediately, or if we can, in a good context. So let's just get started. Here we are. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So let's start with this exhibit, How Artists Reimagine Our Relationship with Death. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you approach this, so we can kind of understand your own process as a curator, and also what you were trying to achieve in terms of the way you sort of organized this exhibition.
Yeah, overall, this exhibition was really trying to show the varied facets of experience with death. Something that I run into a lot when talking about death, either in my own work or as a death doula, is it can get boxed in to very narrow understanding of what it means to die and how to die. And so I wanted to include a range of topics that the artists were addressing, from the personal to the political to this like larger understanding of shared rituals. So trying to find not only that variety, but also how they connected through material and how that could weave, a cohesive thread throughout.
Right. And so tell us a little bit about this work by MK. And what was it about it that's particularly spoke to you? I mean, people can take a look at the exhibitions. We'll definitely put a link for those who may not have a link to that. So I'll just put that in the panel so people can take a look. But do you want to explain this work a little bit for those who may not be as aware?
Yeah, so this was a real treat. I first encountered MK's work several years ago, and when I first saw their piece, The View Inside a Casket, I actually did experience it online, and I had reached out to them. This was, I think, back in 2020, and I was like, I don't know what yet, but I want to plan a show and I want to include your piece and talk to you about it. And they were all excited. We hadn't even met in person. And just I was so drawn to so many aspects of it. But obviously 2020, then COVID happened. And so a lot of the things that I was, brainstorming on really just went to the wayside. So I was so happy that they were also excited to participate in this way several years later. So this piece is really looking at it literally states the inside of a casket, because it's looking at how do we have a relationship with someone's gravesite, and how can that bleed into these larger areas of our relationship to the deceased person, because they're talking about a loss that happened before they were even born, and it still has this long-term impact on their life and their family dynamic. And so what I found really not only interesting but important about it is it speaks to, in some ways, this idea that there's a timeline to grief. Often you'll hear people say after a year you should have it all figured out and you're back to normal, quote unquote. But in this sense, having this sibling pass away before they were even born, there was no clear delineation of, oh, my grief should end now. It was more so, how do I integrate this person who is really important to my family and to my life moving forward without ever having that physical relationship. And so it's really a beautiful way of continuing and devoting to that connection. And so a big part of what initially drew me to it was the physical material that is so it's really iconic with the baby's breath and the soil, but it's handled in such a delicate and loving way. I did see some pictures online when I first saw it, where I saw them laying out every stencil of the soil. It was so dedicated and patient with honoring this person and this relationship, and also their own understanding of who they are in this family structure, given that this loss occurred. So there were a lot of layers to it, but it was something that I felt really kicked off the show in a good way, because it has this presence to it.
Right. And so do you want to talk, because I think one of the things I learned from you, and I mean, I always knew a little bit, but I think you said it so clearly about the myths of the 5 stages of grief. Maybe it's a good
Yes.
time. This is a good time to talk about that a little so people can kind of understand. So what is it about those myths and why do they persist? And do you want to explain what the 5 stages of grief and why, what is so incorrect about that?
This is my favorite myth to debunk, and I think some people who know me are probably sick of me saying this at this point. But the 5 stages of grief is not real. It's based on a study originally with people who were dying, and so as people were dying, they were being interviewed about some common experiences that they were going through, and the research originally stated that this is not linear and it's not something that every single person will experience. These are just some common categories that you might see exhibited by someone who is actively dying. And it's also tied to other things in their life. So if you're seeing someone go through this anger stage, it might not really be because they're literally angry that they're dying. It might be because there's a deeper family dynamic going on where they don't feel heard, they don't feel seen, and maybe their anger is just a facade for their fear that they're not supported in this experience. And so what happened was, over time, this study was kind of extrapolated and people wanted to apply it to other things. And at one point, the researcher like kind of said, "Oh, I guess you could also use it for grief," but then later said, "No, that was never the intention." So the thing that I like to just let people know is that, first of all, this is a rough assessment of people who are dying, not people who are grieving. And also, what's really important about debugging it is that when you remind people that there's not this clear cut 5 linear stages that are set on a specific timeline, you also break down this feeling of, oh, I'm grieving wrong, or oh, someone, they're not acting normal because they're not doing it this way, you know. And so on an internal level, people who are grieving can feel a little bit less pressure of like, yes, I have this grief and it's painful, but I don't also have to feel shame that I'm not doing it right. And then also for their community, their surrounding community, to be more understanding, like, this information you've heard, it's not accurate. And so you might be concerned that someone is, quote unquote, like still sad after however long. But there's really nothing wrong with that. It's just this catchphrase that's kind of gotten plastered everywhere. People
Right.
use it so often in movies and TV and stories, and it just makes me crazy because it's just not accurate. And I
That
think it
makes
adds
sense.
a lot of extra pain that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, and one of the people attending just wanted to mention the important work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I guess has worked on 5 stages of grief and stuff. So just want to acknowledge that. Thank you, Astrid, for mentioning that. I also saw somebody had raised their hand in the event. Unfortunately, we aren't going to be inviting people on, but if you'd like to leave a question, we're happy to address it. So feel free to add your question and we will address it as soon as we can.
Yes, so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the one who did the original study, and so it's her work that has really been extrapolated into this hallmark idea of grief.
Right. And as you said, it was a much more complicated, it was more about dying rather than grieving. One of the things about grieving, I think, is I mean, many of us have different reactions, but when my father passed away, one of the things I thought was interesting was how people look to you to perform a type of grieving. Do you know? And depending on the cultural background or the way. Now, how do artists deal with that? Because that is such an important part, right, about grieving and death. But at the same time, it sounds, based on what you're saying, it's also not an accurate way because it's sort of an expectation not based on your own sort of emotional landscape, perhaps. Now, what is that connection, or have you seen a connection in that at all? And do artists address that?
You know, I've seen it to varying degrees. I think in the next work below MK's for Nirmal, it's interesting because with these different pieces, they're part of this larger experience where she returned to India and purposefully participated in a lot of these different ceremonies for her father, and in different artist talks and conversations has talked about how, like, it was really important to do those things that to some extent felt performative, but that they also were, some of them felt like I don't like a disconnect between, you know, what was the actual emotional experience and what was happening in the surrounding community. And so I think to some extent I've seen that, but overall I do feel like a lot of the artists that I've talked to who talk about grief in their work is this sense of, this is a space where I can show more of the complexity and the nuance, whereas in the personable there is more of that expectation of like, oh, you don't look sad, or you look too
Right.
sad.
That's right. It's right. Or you know, it's funny how we sort of process that. So do you want to talk about Nirmal Raja's piece a little bit? I mean, the central image particularly is quite beautiful in terms of how it's sort of all organized. And maybe you can explain what we're looking at a little bit.
Yeah, and so this is another really delicate and you know, work of patience, I think, from Nirmal, which was taking a lot of her father's clothing and notebooks and either having them printed onto these pillows, or taking the clothing itself and dipping it into slip and then firing it. And so it was it was really this push and pull process of both like creating more of a record of things that he had left behind that she, you know, collected, but also through making this piece, destroying some of the things that he left behind. So the shirts are now like essentially disintegrated, you know, through this process, and really thinking about how you can honor someone through, you know, the memory of their belongings, but also use that as a way to move forward and not, you know, hold on in a way that's unhealthy. And so I think it was this kind of, again, the process of creating something new and adding to that legacy, but also of letting go of certain things and finding a way to cleanse.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the Jonathan Herrera Soto piece, because I think there's something really poetic about this that translates well in photographs. A lot of these pieces look like they're probably in person, but this one really translates in the way it's sort of dealing with the image. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you particularly found interesting about this work?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you would use the word poetic because Jonathan also writes poetry as part of his larger artistic practice. And so I think something that's interesting about the way that he works is that just like this installation, there's so many layers to how something is created that's all incredibly intentional to what is communicated in the final product, even if it's not always there. And so there's a really great video on his website where he's talking about when you're like cutting out these stencils for this face, it's kind of this aggressive, violent thing, and nobody sees that process. He's really involved in that process, but then on the opposite end, the visitors coming through and stepping on these faces is also very violent. And so there's this whole cycle throughout the creation and the installation and the experience, and then the cleaning up of the piece, that all really speak to this larger physicality of what is happening to these people and their bodies. And so everything that I've seen of his has those layers, and I think that's what I'm so drawn to, is that I know that there's a million more things that even I can't see, but that they're intentionally there and creating this this really thoughtful look at this person who, in this sense, has become almost anonymous, but is taken care of and also, given an alternate form of memorial.
Right. And these, I just want to mention for those who may not know, these are all the faces of slain Mexican journalists. And because there have been a lot of attacks on journalists in Mexico, as well as other places, unfortunately. But and these are their faces to sort of give a face to them. But also the cleaning up of the piece is kind of interesting. So what is it about that? Like, what is that as part of the process? Because as much as it is about like grieving, it also feels like bringing in the notion of labor, do you know, and sort of like the work of maybe mourning or grieving or something like that. How would you characterize it?
Yeah, I think it's both what you just said, which is that there is a lot of labor to grieving and to what it means to memorialize someone. And then also on the opposite end of this, the implication of the visitors who are stepping on this piece and carrying out parts of it with, when he's out here washing it away, I mean, there's this larger way that these people have already been erased. And so I feel that he's doing multiple things in contradicting ways when he's taking this care with it, but also and enacting another layer of this physical violence, and but also somehow imposing it on himself, because you see that he's wearing like a piece of black fabric over his head. And so I think it's one of those moments where it's really beautiful, but it's also really devastating. And I think he handles that balance very well. So you want to learn more, and that you want to know what's happening here, what's happened to these people. but that there's still enough of that reality, of that harshness, that it's not lost, that this is something that's very serious.
Right. And to be clear, for people who may not know, these are mud. So he's using mud for these, correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I just want to mention Oceana Sawyer just made a comment saying, enjoying seeing your work has evolved in the realm of death and grief. Excuse me. What do you notice about how people of the global majority are depicted in death and grief? Ooh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to that as well. I think a lot of times it's depicted as something that is like a spectacle and is seen as almost like a source of entertainment, of not necessarily of happy entertainment, but of some sort of like consumerist product. And it's also very, I mean, in that sense and in other senses, it's incredibly exploited. And so another thing that I really appreciate about the work that Jonathan's doing here is that he's taking a lot of care with each of these people and really trying to show a love, truly. And so, I mean, there's so many layers to that question, because there's a lot of really deep and rich practices behind different communities, and a lot of the times, similar to our earlier discussion, when things have become industrialized and commercialized, those things get pushed back and they get hidden, and there's also an erasure that happens. And so you have this really horrible combination of exploitation of like the moment and the cause of death a lot of times, but then you also have this distancing from things that have normally brought healing and consolation, so it's really fraught. And I think there's some great work being done. I don't know if folks have heard of a collective for radical death studies, but it's looking at the scholarship around death and dying and decolonizing it, and really trying to make more clear some of those things that have been on a more general level of society that have been pushed under, and bringing them to the surface, and also giving the authority of those things like back to the people who they belong to. So I think it's a great resource if people are looking
Absolutely.
for different readings, different folks to connect with.
That's great. Yeah, and I guess we have a comment here. The global majority are actually the dead, yes, which I guess is a bit of a wry comment to sort of point out that, there's this comment here in New York. They say there are more dead people than living people in Queens, New York, right? And I guess this is speaking to that, how the fact that the dead are kind of in the world, there's so many, right? There's so many figures. Now, how do you think artists are sort of like, because part of the issue with the topic of the global majority and representations of death is the fact that, without falling into the traps of certain media representations, how do you think artists have been resisting falling into those traps where, like you said, entertainment or the idea of particularly bodies of color, people of color, how bodies are sort of put on display or sort of like shown, and whether, I mean, it's also true in museums, it's also true in other spaces where certain bodies are sort of allowed to be represented in a certain kind of way, while other bodies are perhaps not given the same type of care, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think artists have been sort of thwarting that?
I think the way that I've seen it a lot with the artists I've worked with is that there is this reconnecting and this reclaiming of things that are personally and culturally significant, and having that be more of the center of how they're thinking about the work, how they're creating the work, and also how they are presenting it for an audience that maybe doesn't have that sensitivity and that understanding. And so that's both one of trying to have a baseline of, this is what this really is, and you can't misinterpret it because I'm telling you this is what it is, but also of not putting everything out there. Like, there are things that are protected, and I think that's important as well. In conversation with some of these artists, not everything that is the personal, the cultural, that is thought about while making is something that is necessarily overtly shared, because it does have that layer of protection around it. And so it's a balance, and not everybody has the same balance of it. It depends often on how close the different deaths that you're speaking to are. But it is something that I've seen artists like going back and forth with, how do you toe that line to share and to make this something that can't be ignored, but also not make it vulnerable to bad actors,
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. It's the idea of also, allowing people access to certain parts of the grieving or certain parts of the rituals, and then having other parts of the rituals or grieving that are more personal and perhaps even family-based or community-based, which I think, particularly in Indigenous communities, has been something that has been very, strongly guarded because of that sort of ability to sort of reject that kind of access sometimes. Beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now Jeremy Dennis's work, Sacredness of the Hills series. I think many people may know his work because he was actually a past fellow. And I just wanted to talk about this because I just think Jeremy's been doing some incredible work. And I'm so glad that you're sort of able to sort of show this. Now, what do you think it is about his photographs or the way he captures his photographs that sort of contribute to this conversation?
I think it's part of it is this level of ambiguity where, as noted in the text, but also as you might wonder when you're looking at these images, on the left, there is this literal, truck that's clearing dirt from what is, meant to be this burial site. And so you might look at it and wonder, like, is the person who's sitting here, someone who is protesting that this is happening? Are they the person who is being dug up, and this is like their spirit that's here and being disrupted and disturbed? And in a way, each of the images is kind of both. It's this person who's witnessing it, it's this person who's being disturbed, it's this person in the future who's looking back at these traditions and the things that have led up to what has made it so easy for someone to come in and just bulldoze a grave. I think what's really notable about why sometimes this is allowed is because it's designated as an unmarked burial, and it's not really unmarked. It's just not marked in this current conventional way. And so it's almost dismissed as, oh, well, this isn't like official, it's not in what someone else considers to be a cemetery. And so it's almost like demoted in the way that it is a protected space. And so there's this ambiguity happening, and there's something that's connecting the past to the present, because in the center, there's a landscape that looks like the place where this person has been buried, but is actually taken in another state because that place used to look like this, and throughout the history of colonization and the way that invasive species have been brought in, it no longer looks like this. But you can imagine what it may have looked like when this person was originally laid to rest. And so I think it's something that is both visually, it's well crafted, and also speaks to an ongoing issue that people can actively engage with if they take that time to learn more about what's happening in these images.
Great. So now we're looking at the work of Rasham Mantri. Do you want to talk a little bit about this piece and again how it fits into the larger exhibition?
Yeah, so I mean, so far in my mind, it's kind of expanded from a really personal example to these political examples. And Rasham here is looking at how we can build community through our different death rituals. And in this sense, is more so after the fact. A lot of times, I think many people who've lost someone have this experience of there's this huge peak of the funeral and all the things you have to get done, and then afterwards there's a strange period where you might be going through someone's belongings and trying to figure out what to do with them. And you maybe have to clear out a house, or maybe, you know, in this case, a surviving parent has to find a new way to navigate. And so in this sense, they've found a way to create a communal space for people who are outside of their family unit, while centering their mother, and then their father is present through these photographs that are playing on a slideshow. And so one of the communal acts that's happening is that they're serving their mother's chai and kind of creating a mock home setting on stage. And so it's really looking at, you know, we have maybe a set standard of ways that people come to a viewing, and maybe they drop off cookies at your house a week after. But what are other ways that we can come together in community to help people through these other parts of the transition of death? That, you know, once the dust has settled, there's still things that you need to integrate into your life. And so it's something that I've experienced, where you start going through those mementos, through those photos, and it can be almost more acute in the emotions than sitting through a funeral. And so in this case, they're really looking outward to their community and saying, how can you help me get through my father's photographs, because they have such emotion and history to them. And so I find it to be an interesting question about what community building can look like in the arts, especially because Racham is also a death doula. So we both actually met through going with Grace as student guides. And so it's a fun connection there as well, of how are other artists who are also death doulas combining these things, because we all have a unique way of doing so.
Yeah, and just to be clear for people, that's the artist's mother on stage, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so just in case people are wondering about that. And now we're moving on to your own work, because this is sort of an unusual thing where we sort of, you know, brought in your work, because this is part of the bigger dialogue you've been very much engaged in. Do you want to explain your work a little bit? And then I have a question I'll ask afterwards.
Yeah, and I will just preface this by saying I normally don't put myself in shows that I curate, but this topic has been so central to my practice that I felt like I had to, because this is why I'm doing this work. You know, it's all part of this larger experience for the past you know, several years for me, and so it was hard for me to do it, but it felt necessary. And so you know, yeah, I these are my peers, and I see it very much as a way to integrate myself with my peers. And I've dealt with death and dying in a various ways throughout the years, and I have several concurrent series, but this one in particular is looking at reimagining the conventional cemetery and also the burial vessels that go with it. And so speaking to this idea of why do these conventions exist the way that they do? How can they be more personalized? How can they incorporate things that are really significant to those who are left behind, but also what the dying person wants for their own memorial? So taking grave markers and caskets and shrouds and urns and making them out of biodegradable materials, both for their visual qualities and the colors and the textures, but also their ephemeral qualities, because something I'm interested in advocating for is various green burial practices. And it's not like a one, like, yes, you're doing it or not, you're doing it. It's kind of like a sliding scale. And how can we be more mindful about the way that we leave things behind for the environment, even after our own death?
Yeah, absolutely. So somebody, Layla Shaban has said, when presenting artwork that deals with heavy themes like grief, death, and violence, what are ways the space can invite viewers to engage with it deeply and self-soothe afterward? I guess this is a good question, because many of us, you know, walking into a gallery may not be ready to kind of confront this and sort of have our own emotional responses that can be very intense, I imagine. What do you suggest? I'm guessing this is coming from somebody in the art community who might want to make a work or curate a piece. What are some of the experiences you've had?
Yeah, certainly. I think a big part of it is setting the tone. I really don't believe in just showing something for shock value. I think creating an environment where people feel like they're moving through an experience is important. Um, on a personal level, I think with my own work, I try to add different elements of humor sometimes to make it something where it's not all one tone. And I think a lot of the other artists that I work with, they do this to varying degrees, whether it's humor or elements of beauty, adding something that is not, it's not contrary to the experience, it's just another nuanced part of it. And as a curator and as someone who has gone through work with death doulas, I always like to include something that is a resource guide. So whether that's a really simple list of resources people can look and more, or find healing options for themselves, but also having programming that is paired so that people can know, hey, if I want to explore this more and I need maybe some guidance or just a safe space to do it, I think art is one of the best places to do that. You can really explore things that are hard to say out loud or hard to even think sometimes. But if you're working through it with material and with creativity, it becomes less about finding the perfect words and less about, oh, will I say the wrong thing, and more about just having an outlet for those big feelings.
Yeah, I'm just going to play this while we continue our
Oh,
conversation
yeah,
without
of
the
course.
volume, so that we can still talk, but people can take a look a little
Oh,
bit.
gotcha.
They can watch it on the website if they like. They more than you know, just watching the images only. So now this piece, I mean, visually, this is one of the things about death related. The imagery is always so rich, right?
Yeah.
And it's there's so many sort of layers, colors, patterns, textures, which isn't, maybe something as common. Now, tell us a little bit about this piece, and also why do you think that so much time or so much of those sort of visual language around death, why it's so rich, and maybe where some of the deficiencies are for, in your opinion, or you wish was more rich in certain aspects.
No, I mean, I think, and this is just my personal interpretation, but even though a lot of people seem to have this idea that if they don't think about or talk about death, that it's like not real, I think that death really is emblematic of every layer of life. And so that's why I think it's so rich, is because they say like, oh, your life will flash before your eyes. Like there's so much life in death, and it doesn't mean that it's like painless. It's just a part of it. It's actually in A Young's video, I think, is a great example of how it's very cyclical, and that's not something that creates friction. It's really something that creates a rhythm and that creates a continuity, and that's what really originally drew me to the piece. And I did want to say that this piece is another work that's very collaborative, and I feel that that's important to what the work means and what it is. So this piece also features A Young's mother, Gemma, but is in collaboration with artist Nicholas O, and features a dancer, So Hey Kim. And so in this way, there is multiple voices coming to the table, both for the creation of these objects that are in the video itself, but also of the movements and how does one person interpret a dance versus how another person does. And I think that that layering that comes from involving multiple people in your process is part of what makes it rich, and it's also part of what makes death rituals so important and how they bring people together to not only honor ourselves in grief, but in this case, honoring the deceased and helping to cleanse for their transition.
Oh, absolutely. So
Mm-hmm.
let's go to some of these questions. I'm going to stop sharing this. People can
Okay.
kind of take a look. Thank you so much for walking us through your exhibition. So Emily F is mentioning that regarding self-soothing, they just learned about Death Cafe which is a good place for people let people talk about death freely. Do you have any experience of that, or do you know anything about the Death Cafe?
Yeah, it's similar to this idea of like when you're finding the right death doula for you and what they offer, what you're seeking. Death cafes kind of run the gamut in terms of what they're like. They can be very intimate, just a couple people. They can be a huge crowd. Sometimes they're virtual, sometimes they're in person. But it's really, it's really a way to intentionally create space for having more open conversations about death. That's a huge part of healing, repairing, and reconnecting with death practices, is just even being able to talk about it in the first place. And so death cafes are a great place if you're curious, if you're trying to like feel it out, you'll probably meet some cool folks. And normally it's kind of a mix. It's like people who are in that feeling it out stage, and then there's people who are death doulas and they like host them or they show up to everyone, and so you get a really good range of like perspectives as well, which is important.
And so now we have a question by Paloma Pavel. Have you worked with palliative care or hospice chaplains in a team? I guess they're sharing, they said, we had an amazing experience working with musicians and artists who were also chaplains when my mother, an artist, entered the actively dying process. It was transformative for our entire family. They took her poetry and helped us create songs and rituals. Also, death of species, eco art, ritual. We had a memorial for the whales in the SF Bay area when the 72nd whale was beached up in Point Reese. So I guess they're sharing a little bit about what is this actively dying process. I guess that's also, is that part of this, part of your experience as a death doula?
Yeah, I haven't worked with like a whole team like that, but it is something that when someone's actively dying and they have different moments of lucidity, it is a great opportunity to have these experiences together. They're both a way to, support the person who's dying and create this moment for the loved ones to find that soothing, as mentioned. And I think that even though earlier I mentioned sometimes there's this critique of death doulas, like, hey, hospice already exists, like, what are you doing? I think a lot of times, not only death doulas, but people who are interested in similar things to death doulas about enriching the dying experience can bring these types of experiences into that process. And it's not always possible. Every dying situation is unique, but where it is possible, it brings tremendous healing. And it also, it can be a lasting memory for people to have with their loved one, as opposed to what is often the stereotypical complaint of like, oh, there's just the hospital monitor beeping and weird smells, and then that was it, or other things that are much more active in terms of the process of dying can come with different physical reactions from the person who's dying. And so in this case, I do think it can bring another layer to what it means to sit with someone as they're dying, and also noting some of the science behind dying. And they say, oh, that hearing is the last thing to go. And so if you're incorporating something like music or something where people are sharing stories, it's not going to get lost on that person. They can still experience it as well.
Right. So I'm just going to post this. Someone posted this question, an anonymous attendee, about death cafes and death cafes here in New York. So I don't know about them, but I'm just going to approve this so that people can take a look. So please just take a look. Also, Paloma also mentioned, thank you for offering this space. How can we find you outside this day? So I guess, which is the best way to stay in contact with you? Would it be Instagram or something else? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I think Instagram is where I post most of like what's coming up, like what's happening. My website is mostly comprehensive, but Instagram's like my replacement for like a news page on my website. So that's definitely the best way. Should I
Yeah, please, if you can put it in the chat, that would be great for people who may want to know. And also, Lisa Feldman just mentioned, do you know about Morbid Anatomy Museum in Brooklyn? So they have great classes and webinars. something people may want to know about. So absolutely. Okay, great. I'll put it to the host to everyone. We are. So if people
okay. Thanks.
please, no problem whatsoever. So now, if you have questions, now's the time to ask them. We're just going to dive in a little bit more into this material. So what are some of the surprises in terms of practices around dying that you encountered, that you perhaps initially thought would not be part of a process like this, but you found to be, a little bit surprising, but also perhaps culturally specific or something else?
This this might sound like I'm sugarcoating, but I really haven't had many experiences where I felt surprised. I think because going into this, I kind of went into my further exploration of death and dying with the sense that the conventions are kind of like holding us back. And so I was really seeking out all of the different ways, and so it wasn't necessarily anything that surprised me in I would have, I wouldn't expect that. And more so surprising in the sense of like pleasantly surprised, like, wow, that's a really powerful way of moving through something that so many people will say don't have the words for. And so that's part of the motivation for this project, is that I know how I've handled it, but I also know that there's so many other ways, and I want to not only explore it, but share those other ways with other people. And so, yeah, I think more so pleasantly surprised at how nuanced and how personalized people can bring this to the forefront.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed that I wonder if you have a comment on is, like, I feel like people fall into kind of the extremes. Either they go very traditional about their death, in this kind of like, it has to be this way, and then some people kind of love to reinvent it. It feels like there's like poles of these kind of reactions to them. Do you find that?
What's that?
Do you find that as well? Is there a sort of a similar kind of approach as a death doula?
In casual conversation, especially like if you're at an event and you meet someone, you're like, oh, I'm a death doula. Like I do tend to get like one or the other, like someone who's like, oh, like, no, I'm gonna be, like straight and narrow. And someone else is like, I want to be turned into a tree. Like,
I want to be crushed into a diamond.
Right? Yeah, I want my ashes sent out into space, so definitely in like casual conversation, I kind of get those extremes. But I think something that's interesting with a lot of the artists in the show is that it's less so about like completely reinventing something, and more so about bringing traditions into the present and into the future, because of the way things have been separated. When you start to reconnect, it's not the exact same thing that it used to be. And so how do you find ways to bring it forward? And so that's something that middle ground of not necessarily reinventing, but reimagining for the present and the future is something that I'm really interested in talking more about, and like seeing how other people do that.
Yeah. So now we have a question from Hillary Godell. Apologies if I mispronounced that. Was caregiving part of what led you to this place of celebrating death in life? What an interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was my mother's caregiver in the final year of her life. And a big part of what started my process of researching and making art about death and dying was that there was so much that I had no clue about going into it. It was kind of like I was just thrown into the deep end. And I look back and I think, well, if I would have known, X, Y, Z and all these other things, if somebody would have talked to me about this, I feel like it would have been a 180 experience. Like there still would have been this pain of losing this most important person to me. But I wouldn't have had all this extra logistical burden and confusion and frustration of what am I even supposed to be doing right now? And so for me, it's not about like celebrating in the sense of like, this isn't something that's sad ever. It's more about honoring all the multifaceted layers of it, and empowering yourself by being prepared for as much as you can be prepared for. Which is why I'm always encouraging people, like, even if it's the most basic thing, just tell your loved ones like what you want. Even if you don't have all the paperwork figured out right now, just like start that process so that there can be more space for the loving and the honoring that comes with grief, and less of the we have to run to the bank right now because if we don't get this signed, we're not going to have access to the accounts for like 3 years. It's
a real thing. It's a real
yeah.
thing.
So really just that experience, I had experienced other deaths before, but that was definitely by far like the closest personal death. And I was so involved in the process of dying that I was really trying to find out, like, what could this look like if there was a better system in place, if culturally we had more ease in talking about this and preparing each other for not only navigating it, but feeling supported in it. So that was a huge part of my process and experience.
Yeah. So Roz is asking again about this one's a question about where, if you specifically studied somewhere like One Spirit in Manhattan or somewhere else to become a death doula. I guess some people are really interested in this sort of process of how one becomes a death doula.
Yeah. So my journey I really feel like caring for my mother was this incredible learning experience. It was a really painful one because I didn't know what I was doing while I was doing it, but reflecting on it, I realized all these things. I started researching, like reading different books, reading different articles, researching other artists who were dealing with death and dying. Like I was looking at everything from like practical things of caregiving to the neuroscience of pain and death, and how all these things come together. And so eventually that led me to finding a book on caregiving that included a passage about death doulas. And I was like, well, what is this? So I pursued it further, and eventually I took the Going with Grace end of life training. That's when I mentioned Aloha Arthur. It's an amazing course. It's really comprehensive because it starts with looking at one's own relationship to death. So before you can start thinking about supporting someone else through this as a death doula or in that role, like you really need to confront your own mortality and your own understanding of your mortality. And what's great about the course is that you can definitely take it with the intention of becoming a death doula. But it's open to anybody. If you just want to learn more about death and dying, if you want to be a more informed caregiver for someone, if you just want to be, you're researching this from like a scholarly perspective, like anybody can take it. But what's interesting about death doulas is that because it's non-medical, it's not something that has like a national governing body. There are many different places that offer courses, and it's more about supplementing your knowledge of the practices that go into it. But from there, you really do need to identify what you offer as a person, as someone who's called to this work, because it really is more of a calling than anything. I haven't really met anybody who's like just doing it for kicks,
or for the money.
So yeah, but I think Aloha is incredible. She's so thoughtful in how she like weaves the course together. So I always recommend it. I'm biased, but Going with Grace is always got 2 thumbs up from me.
So, by the way, thank you for being with us still. We've gone over the 1 hour mark, but do you have
Okay.
a few more minutes just to wrap up a couple of quick questions and stuff? I just want to share, just some of these comments people are sharing about death cafes, about doulas, the International End of Life Doula Association. Someone just posted a link to that, as well as, I guess, another person, Suzanne O'Brien, who's a registered nurse who also does these. So just sharing those, there are resources in the Q&A there for people who may want to learn a little bit more, which I think is really great. And then Oceana also mentioned another question. How do we bring death back into the life cycle that we all experience? Ooh, another deep question.
I love that.
Like that. Yeah. So how do we do that?
Well, I'm going to say something that gets a lot of strong reactions from people. But I really think the place that is the most neglected in terms of integrating death and life conversations and all that is working with children. There's so many instances where children are entirely left out of the conversation. They're either they experience a loss and the adults around them don't really explain what's happened. There's so many anecdotes of kids not being allowed to go to funerals, like for their own relatives, or they're told that someone just like went to sleep, and so then they think like, oh, should I not fall asleep because then I'm gonna die. And there's so all of the like euphemisms that we use as adults, like the way that we share them with kids, it affects them differently. And so I think a big part of like going towards a more integrated life death culture is helping kids understand what's happening, and giving them the tools, the language, and the support to know that if this does happen, that like it's okay to have big feelings about it, and also that like the world has not like imploded. You might feel this pain of losing someone like that, but that just talking about it, just learning about it, being close to someone who has lost someone is not this thing that needs to be avoided at all costs. There's actually
I think we're getting strong reactions to this because people, like you said, are really passionate. So I just want to share. Marnie Lucas says, thank you, Brianna Hernández. Great conversation, very appreciated. I'm an artist, end-of-life doula, and in my Bardo project, I collaborate with terminally ill artists nationwide to establish legacy projects and agree that children need to be part of the death and dying conversations. And then I think we got another strong reaction from Rachel Dickerson. Yes, I am a PK art teacher, and they are so good at talking about death. We have a lot to learn from them about death.
Yes,
that's interesting too.
We do. I mean, I've done several workshops with various ages of youth, from like 6-year-olds to like high school seniors, and every single time I go into these workshops, whoever the adult is that's like managing it is always really apprehensive. They're like, are you sure? Is this going to be okay? Like, what if somebody cries? And I'm like, crying is not a bad thing. What,
Right.
They get really scared. But then the kids themselves, they just dive into the content. And whether they dive in from the perspective of like curiosity or because they have experienced a loss, they're always really just bravely moving through it and creating beautiful projects and talking about it like with their own language. And I just want to shout out this project. It's called the Artist's Grief Deck, and I didn't make this, but I have a card in it, and it's a series of cards that it's kind of like a set of tarot cards, but it's images of artwork dealing with grief and prompts on the back. And what they did for this project is they have the original version in English and Spanish, but they also have a youth version that is made, the artwork and the prompts are made by youth. And so I think there's so much that, we absolutely can learn from like young people about this experience and just allowing them to move through that. I guess what I said earlier about people with strong reactions is normally they're like, you can't do that because they're gonna.
I don't think this crowd is that way. I think this crowd is like, absolutely.
Yeah, I got a good crowd here, but normally I get that with a lot of.
And there's somebody shared a children's book that might be of interest for people talking to children about death. So thank you for doing that. Now, I just want to, so thank you for everyone for coming, but I have one last question. Seems like there are different organizations that work with death, so I think that's great. So now, what is it that you think artists, I'm just going to respond to this question. Someone's saying, how do we reach out to you? It seems like Instagram would be the best way to reach out to you, or your private website.
Instagram or my website, either one is, I think, email through my website is better than like a direct message on Instagram, because then sense. I can like file it properly.
Right.
But if you just want to stay connected to news and stuff, Instagram is better.
Right, but use a website otherwise. So now, what do you think? What aspect of death do you think artists are not really dealing with yet? or are maybe a little hesitant for various reasons?
I think there's definitely someone out there doing this. I just haven't closely connected with them yet. But I think topics looking at various aspects of disenfranchised grief are really critical to this larger conversation about art and death. When people talk about suicide and homicide and addiction and all these added stigmas, because death itself is this taboo topic, but even within that, if you go to different grief groups, there's these added layers where people feel different elements of why they should be ashamed of talking about what happened to them or their person. And this kind of goes back to this sensationalization where you have these like true crime documentaries and stuff, but then someone who's actually like lost someone to homicide, they feel like ostracized by their community because this really like deeply traumatic thing happened and nobody knows how to talk to them about it, or they feel like, oh, I can't get close to that. And so there are definitely artists who are dealing with this. I just haven't yet connected with them on a deeper level. But I think that that's an important part of really cracking open this larger conversation, because you can't just stop at this surface level of like, let's be okay with death. It's like, no, we have to look at all these intersections of where these ideas of like life and death coming together, where they impact each other. Because chances are, if you have a really bad experience with hospice, it's not just isolated to hospice. It's probably because there are other things in your life that have led up to this, like different disparities that have caused access to quality care. And so I think when we dig deeper into these different layers of disenfranchised grief, we can have a more healthy and more comprehensive understanding and like shared compassion.
Makes sense. So what is it about the pandemic you think that changed people's relationship to this topic, if at all? Because I mean, I will say during a short period, myself and my partner, we lost, I think it was it 6 aunts and uncles within like 8 or 9 months? You know what I mean? And it's like, and I don't think that's unique. Other people have had similar experience where they lose. Now, has that changed people's understanding or relationship at all, the pandemic?
I've definitely seen like a surge in interest in, like, before COVID, I would have a much harder time like being involved in a show where they were like, oh, we don't really know how to market this. So I've definitely seen like a surge in interest in like having a show about it or something. But on a interpersonal level, I've still noticed this huge lack of like language and tools to really dig at that deeper level. I think because it's been made really high on our level of awareness, but not necessarily on our level of understanding. And so it's opened, I think, more of the conversation, but it hasn't really dealt with the conversation, if that makes sense. That's how I've experienced it, at least.
Yeah. So we're getting some nice comments. Rare and compassionate conversation. Thank you for tuning in. And this final comment, I just want to say, because I think this also shows the impact of work like yours has on other people, because I think we don't acknowledge that enough. Anika Kawalek says, I came across the death doula path because of you. I'm an artist focused on ancestry, mysticism, and marronage in my practice. I've had trouble with balancing how much and how little to share because it's so personal. This is so empowering. Thank you.
Oh, my heart.
I love that. And I thank you for sharing that. But also, I just want to sort of end on that note, because I think, the exhibition, the articles, I hope has really helped people think about this topic and talk about this topic and understand that it's not just a historical topic of art, it's a very contemporary topic of art in many ways. And I think some of the work you brought really brought a lot of the complexity, because I think there was still, and I think I'll admit, I had my own stereotypes of what the art might look like, right? You're like, oh, death, funerary art might look like this, or look, and I think you did a wonderful job in sort of exposing us to different ways of doing this. So I just want to say thank you, Brianna. And
thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone for attending. And this is the second Emily Hall Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators talk. We'll have a talk next week, same time, same place, and we hope you join us. And I just want to invite everyone to take a look at the articles, and also just think a little bit about this. Maybe reach out to Brianna if they have any ideas. It sounds like you probably are going to get a lot of people reaching out to you, which I think is wonderful. But also, thank you so much for all your work, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.